for the little spinning ball. Okay, right. So we'll finish up sex week by talking mostly about larvae, um, that being the aim of the whole thing. Some marine critters are what we call direct developers, meaning that the fertilized egg develops into basically a miniature of the adult. Others, the egg might develop into a larva which looks nothing like the adult and may be adapted for a completely different lifestyle. And the larva will eventually transform either gradually or suddenly into the adult. And as for when this happens, there's two major strategies that organisms use for timing sexual reproduction: semal parity and iteroparity. In semal parity, organisms live, they feed, they store up lots of energy, they let it all out in one great big glorious orgy of sexual reproduction, and then they die. Most ocean-going salmon do this sort of thing, and you've probably heard the story that the eggs are laid in mountain streams. The little baby salmon fry float downstream to the ocean, and they may live in the ocean for several years. I think between 3 and 10, if memory serves. And then once they have grown to full size and stored up as much energy as they can, they'll start swimming back upstream, get back to the stream where they were born. The ones that don't get eaten by bears or people spawn there and then die, and then the life cycle repeats itself. Ocean-going salmon do that. Squid and octopus are also noted for doing that. They will store up a lot of energy, reproduce all at once, lay lots of eggs, and then die. Octopus, be it said, are incredibly intelligent invertebrates, and the only thing that is probably saving us from being taken over by our octopus overlords is the fact that they've got no culture, because every baby octopus is an orphan. Every newly hatched octopus, the mother is already dead, because octopi reproduce semalparously. They reproduce with this, once in a lifetime burst and then die. So octopi can't pass on information from one generation to the next, unlike people. That may be the only thing that is saving us from conquest by the octopus dark lords of the deep. Iteroparity, much more familiar. That's repeated reproduction throughout the lifespan. And the reason why there's two strategies is you would expect natural selection should act to maximize total reproductive output. If one strategy gives you more offspring than another strategy, then the strategy that leads to more offspring is going to become dominant in the population. So, for example, if adult mortality is high, if something kills the adults pretty quickly, reproducing all at once may be your best bet, because you might not get a second chance. If you reproduce all at once, you'll leave a large number of offspring, and if you try to pace yourself and reproduce multiple times, you may not get an opportunity to reproduce multiple times if for some reason adult lifespan is low and mortality is high. So there are situations in which semal parity makes sense. Organisms that follow that strategy will leave more offspring than members of the species that don't. And there's other cases where iteroparity makes most sense. If you're looking at fish, there's additional strategies as to where you reproduce. There are fish, of course, that reproduce, stay in the same niche, the same environment all of their lives and reproduce there. But a number of fish are diadromous, meaning they migrate between saltwater and freshwater. Anadromous fish are diadromous fish that breed in fresh water but spend most of their lives in the oceans. And the salmon I just talked about would be a classic example. So for that matter would ocean-going lampreys. Not sure if you're familiar with those. They are jawless fish that reproduce in rivers and lakes. And fairly recently, as in the past century, migrated up into the Great Lakes and are now native there and have seriously done a number on the population of lake trout and damaged the fisheries that used to exist there. But they'll spend most of their lives in the ocean. If you're catadromous, you breed in the ocean, but most of your life is spent in fresh water. Classic example that I'll show you in just a bit is eels in the genus Anguilla. And then there's some that really don't care. They'll migrate between salt and fresh water in no particular order. The classic example of this are bull sharks, which really don't seem to care much about salinity. This is the shark that's been caught in the Mississippi River, if memory serves, as far north up the river as southern Illinois. They could conceivably be caught in the larger rivers of Arkansas, although off the bat, I'm not sure if they ever have. Probably have at some point. So that's anadromous, catadromous, and don't really care adromous. So here's a classic catadromous fish. That's eels in genus Anguilla. They're actually related to a different type of eel that you might be familiar with, a tropical species that lives in crevices in the reef and is famous for its large, very sharp teeth because it's a predator. In fact, it's so famous, there's a song about it. When you swim on the reef, see that eel with big teeth, that's a moray. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, both of you. But this is not the moray. This is just the regular eel. And they will spend much of their lives in fresh water, but they migrate in order to breed. And in fact, they migrate to the Sargasso Sea. If you forgot where the Sargasso Sea is, remember we were talking earlier about gyres, about how the North Atlantic, the other oceans too, but the North Atlantic in particular, has this circular pattern of ocean currents on the surface where you have water coming up the east coast of North America, breaking across the North Atlantic all the way to Britain. And then there is a countercurrent that takes water back around. So water is basically sloshing around and around in a clockwise whirlpool the size of the North Atlantic Ocean. In the center of that whirlpool, you don't have very strong currents at all. And that is a zone where, because you have low current flow, there are brown seaweeds that are adapted to a floating lifestyle. And you have these masses of floating brown seaweed called sargassum weed. And there are lots of fish and things that are adapted to living among the sargassum blades. And this area is called the Sargasso Sea. And I promise you I'm being honest about this. I'm not being sarcastic at all. Get it? Right. Anyway, it wasn't until October 2015 that we successfully managed to track an eel by satellite tagging. The technology had to wait until you could miniaturize the electronics enough that you could actually put a tracking chip in able to and they released it off the coast of Nova Scotia, where they and then you can see the track of eel and the head and heads right for the Sargasso Sea. And this is where eels will actually spawn and lay eggs. And this is what they hatch into. The females lay millions of eggs in the Sargasso Sea, then they die, and the eggs actually hatch into what are called leptocephalus larvae, which look like this. Leptocephalus larvae look kind of like leaves with a fish head at one end. This is typical of eels. There's also some species of bony fish that are related to eels, like tarpon, that develop through a leptocephalus stage. I don't know if you've heard of tarpon. They're popular fighting game fish in the Gulf of Mexico. They're fun to catch, or so I am told. We actually, when I was in high school, we played a team from New Orleans where the tarpon was actually the mascot. Right. Okay, someone else has joined our throng, and I think I've got them added, so let us continue. Yeah, sorry you missed the eel song. Okay, the larvae then just drift in the currents of that North Atlantic gyre, and American eels will swim up into rivers. European eels have to go all the way around that gyre and get transported all the way to Europe. You can see where the American eels go, and then the European eels go. Those letters are the first names of months. So you can see there's a track leading to Europe that starts in March, June, September, December, March, June, September, December, March, June, September, December. It might take 3 years for those European eel populations to make it all the way back to Europe, even longer if they're going by way of the Mediterranean Sea. So they will spend possibly several years at sea before finally getting back to their rivers, live there for a longer time, and then return back to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. So that is the life of an eel. Apparently the American and European eels are separate species, even though they breed in the same place. For whatever reason, they don't seem to hybridize very often. Other fish, of course, may not migrate from the ocean to fresh water or vice versa, but they'll migrate to different regions of the ocean for feeding and or for reproducing. This can create problems in conservation because ocean life doesn't really care about territorial boundaries. Right? There is a large body of law defining what parts of the ocean belong to what countries, what they can do with it, how far their area of influence moves out, how wide is their exclusive economic zone, basically the zone in which they can fish. There have been not major wars that I can think of, but definitely conflicts between countries over access to fishing grounds. And the problem with all of this is that fish don't care where the boundaries are. And species that migrate a long distance will often move in and out of countries' territorial waters. And of course, they can move into the open sea, which is not the territory of anybody. And so one nation's conservation policy, or possibly the lack thereof, can have global effects because the fish don't know, oh, hey, wow, we're in American territorial waters. We have to follow their rules. Fish don't care. There's a lot of work being done on trying to tag where fish go. And these are some results. A program called TOP, Tagging of Pelagic Predators. Each of these is a different predator species shown in a different color. The red zigzags that you see are the tracks of salmon sharks. And you can see some of them go very far out to sea. but they tend to move mostly along the Pacific coast. So what the United States and Canada do will have a pretty large effect on them. But there's others that head more or less due west. You can see that bundle of what looks like green silly string. There's overlap, but it tends to extend more west of the Pacific coast rather than going along the Pacific coast. That's northern elephant seals. So you can see that they feed in different areas. They migrate into different regions. And something going wrong in one part of that range might affect the species over its entire range. If we were to have, let's say, some catastrophe affecting the salmon sharks in Alaska, that's going to have repercussions for the population all the way down the Pacific coast. So anyway, living things produce eggs. In many animals, they will hatch into basically miniature adults, and we call those juveniles. And we call this direct development. A lot of fish will either hatch eggs or give birth to babies that look like miniatures of the adults. They're not anatomically particularly different. Baby sharks do come to mind. On the other hand, in some cases, eggs will hatch into larvae, which don't look anything like adults. You've already seen those leptocephalus fish larvae that don't look anything like eels, right? Those are the ones that look kind of like leaves with a fish head stuck on. And the larvae may fairly gradually change into the adult form. Very often, they will develop relatively abruptly into the adult form by a process called metamorphosis, a term that you may already know because we use it for things like caterpillars transforming into butterflies. Many larvae will swim freely for a time before they settle down. Larvae that feed on yolk throughout the larval stage are called lessithotrophic. Trophane is ancient Greek for to feed. Lessithotrophic larvae are feeding on their yolk stores. Planktotrophic larvae feed while they're in the water column. So here's a typical larva. This guy is less than a millimeter in size. And I've seen them swimming around. They're a lot of fun to watch. They look a little bit like very slow and graceful X-wing fighters, of all things. This is a type of larva called an Ophiopluteus. It's the larva of a marine creature called a brittle star. Looks like a starfish. There's some anatomical differences we don't need to get into. It's got 4 larval arms. Within the arms, those bright stick-looking things, that's actually the larval skeleton. There's a mouth up at the, more or less right at the center. The circular thing that you see a bit below the center is the stomach. It's got a complete gut. And it actually will feed by this stage. Will feed on small algae and things like that. Here's the cool thing. If you zoom into the left side and look closely, this is the right side of the picture. It's the left side of the larva. You can see on the right of the picture, there's a few little bud-like structures that are not visible in the same position on the left. That's the beginning of the adult body. And the adult actually forms inside the larval body all the time that the larva is swimming around and feeding. A few set-aside cells inside the larval body are beginning to lay down what the adult is going to be. And once the stage has advanced a little farther, it starts looking like this. That darkish thing kind of in the middle of the picture is the actual brittle star juvenile. and the remains of the old larva are still sticking around. Those are those three kind of long stick-looking parts of it. That's what's left of the old larva. This will eventually be absorbed. In other species, what's left of the larva will actually swim off by itself and may just kind of swim around for several days. And that juvenile will drop to the bottom and develop into an adult that looks like this. So it's interesting. You'll have larvae occupying very different ecological niches from the adult, living a completely different lifestyle, subject to different predators, different environmental challenges. So yeah, during the life cycle, the same species may occupy two very, very different niches. So there, kind of neat. By way of comparison, this is a lessitotrophic larva of a critter called a sea cucumber, which happens to be a distant relative of the brittle star. It's in the same phylum along with sand dollars and sea urchins and starfish, things like that. You'll notice that, at D, the larva is basically a ball with a dent in it. It doesn't have all of those long arms or the larval skeleton or anything like that. At F, that stuff, abbreviated PT, that's where the mouth is coming in. I think, yeah, that should be about where the mouth is going to be. Over at G, the things labeled BT, those are little tentacles that are forming around the mouth. And by the time you get to I, you've got the adult, and the adult looks like a very elongated, squishy cucumber with tentacles around its mouth. BT stands for buccal tentacles. And these don't develop a gut until they settle down. They'll float around for a little bit, but the egg basically develops directly into the adult stage and doesn't go through that extended larval stage that looks radically different from the adult. And because it's lessitotrophic, the larva never actually feeds. Another awesome example that I love is barnacles. This is a larval barnacle, and it's got kind of a pear-shaped body. It's got 3 pairs of legs. It may look like 4, but the second pair of those legs is actually branched. Promise you it's 3. Kind of in the middle of the head, you can see a single red spot. That's the eye spot. They can sense light. And there's a pair of little horns on either side of the eye spot. This is a type of larva called a nauplius. You could find these guys in Lake Conway, and in fact I have, looking at the creepy crawlies in the water, because I hesitate to say absolutely all, but an awful lot of crustaceans, crab, shrimp, lobsters, crawfish, copepods, and anostracans and things like that go through this stage, go through a stage that looks very much like this, the so-called nauplius stage. Barnacle adults don't look very much like crustaceans, but because they have this nauplius stage, that's evidence that barnacles are in fact crustaceans that are just very highly modified. A barnacle nauplius will transform into a larva that's got 2 valves surrounding its body, superficially looking like a clam, but it's actually not, called a cypress. And the cypress larva will find a rock to attach to, preferably a big rock that's shaped like a mountain or something like that, so that the cypress can attach to this mountain-shaped rock and call it Cypress Hill. That was a joke. Sorry, Cypress Hill was this musical group that did this cool song called "Insane in the Membrane." Yeah, yeah, and post millennials don't recognize good music when you hear it. Right. Anyway, so the cypress will attach head down to some suitable rock or whatever it is and transform into an adult. The adult basically has its head glued to the rock. It's still got a gut. Those legs that it used to use for swimming now get used to sweep the water and pick up food particles and transport them down to the mouth of the barnacle, and the entire thing is covered in calcium carbonate rich external skeleton that looks like this. Very small distances in the ocean are sometimes referred to as the microscale. So you might talk about microscale turbulence or something like that. And on the microscale, larvae use chemical cues to figure out where to settle. They don't entirely have a free choice because it depends on where the currents are going. But they might settle in some places because currents are tending to direct them to those places. They'll also taste the water, and in some cases, larvae will settle in response to chemicals from adults of their own species. They can sense, where the grown-ups are, and they will try to settle down there. A larger spatial scale is called the mesoscale, and larvae do get transported by currents. A great many of them do. And in some cases, current patterns keep them close to shore. What you're looking at here is a map of the ocean between Ireland and Britain, Wales down in the south, and north of England up to the north. In the middle, there's a large island called the Isle of Man. The areas that have the diagonal shading are muddy, and there's a gyre in the Irish Sea that separates Britain from Ireland. That gyre, the fact that the currents are going round and around and around, keeps larval lobsters from dispersing very far. Be kind of like trying to disperse out of the center of a traffic circle. Living in Conway, I know you know quite a lot about traffic circles. We're kind of famous for ours. And think about it. If you're in the center of a traffic circle, it's not that easy to get out because there's traffic going all around you all the time. Something similar going on here. That circular flow of currents means that larval lobsters don't disperse very far. You also get muddy patches building up in the center of that gyre, and that happens to be where the adult lobsters live. Ultimately, this sort of thing is important to know if you're concerned about managing your lobster population, making sure it doesn't get overfished, making sure it stays healthy. You need to know where they're coming from. In other cases, larvae are not restricted to one place, and we call these teleplanic larvae. Tele is Greek for far, long distance, like television, distant seeing, telephone, distant sound, teleplanic, distant travel. What you're looking at there is all of those circular symbols. Some of them are open and some of them are filled. Particular snails have turned up when the ocean was being sampled. The reason that they're in straight lines is that ships tend to sail in straight lines. So they'd send ships out, take plankton samples, and check them for larvae. And the large circles show finds of larvae of coastal species. And as you can see, some of those finds, the large circles with the radiating lines and the shading in, those represent places where the larvae of coastal snail species were found. And you can see in places they're thousands of miles from any coast. This kind of thing is not that easy to study because, well, it's not that easy to study because you have to go out in the open ocean in a big boat, and those are kind of expensive, expensive and labor intensive to operate. But at least some of those coastal snail species have larvae that can end up dispersing very, very far indeed. So we talked a long time ago about speciation in the oceans and about how populations have to be divided. In some cases, thousands of miles of ocean may not be enough to divide a species into several separated populations, because those teleplanic larvae may end up covering a great deal of ground. Okay, by the way, I will send you the information in an email, but I've just got information on 2 summer internships. Well, one is a summer internship working with sharks. The other is the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory, which is operated by the University of Southern Mississippi and is located on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They're going to be offering classes in the summer of 2021. And UCA is part of a group of universities that is allowed to send its students there and take these courses, and they count towards your major. So I do the best I can with what I've got, but Arkansas, is one of the more ocean-free states of the U.S. But if you actually want to go swimming with the dolphins, which you can, or, study ocean life in an actual ocean instead of staring at a screen in a flipping landlocked state, this might be a terrific opportunity. You do still have to pay. They do charge tuition, but everybody I know that has taken courses down there has absolutely loved them and learned a tremendous amount. It's a great experience if you can. Both of those opportunities will be in the summer of 2021. Might be a good time to start planning now if you can do it, because that would be a great way for you to learn more marine biology in a couple of weeks than I can teach in a whole semester.